So I've been studying the second half of the book of John to work on another video on John because, it's nice to kind of keep on with the same book and finish off what we started. And as I've been studying, I've seen that there's really relatively little geography except for Jerusalem. So I've been spending a lot of time looking at maps of Jerusalem and looking at archaeological reports and trying to figure out where these places mentioned by John would have been. And a lot of them we're not sure, but I'm going to walk through this map with you and just kind of informally give an overview of where some of these places were or possibly could have been that Jesus visited in the days leading up to his death and resurrection. So here we have an image of modern day Jerusalem. We can zoom in, see the Dome of the Rock area pretty clearly here. This is the old city of Jerusalem. You can still see kind of the outline of the wall. And I will outline that there for you. So this is roughly where the modern wall runs. And this is roughly where the Dome of the Rock is today and what is believed to have been the temple in the time of Herod and then Jesus. So those are two of our big main landmarks that are still visible today and that we can base some of our other things on. A couple other landmark type things that we are aware of are the valleys. And if I do them one by one, we have the Kidron Valley, which is specifically mentioned in John that Jesus crossed over. We have the Hinnom Valley running along there. And we have the Tyropoeon Valley kind of running through the middle of Jerusalem. We also have the Mount of Olives, which is roughly this yellowish area here. If you've been to the area of Jerusalem, you have likely seen these three towers that I'm marking on top of the Mount of Olives, visible from many areas in the region. The Hebrew University Water Tower, the Augusta Victoria Tower, and the Russian Orthodox Bell Tower. Those aren't really relevant to our story, but if you've seen them, they are a very memorable landmark for recognizing the Mount of Olives. So we have our valleys, we have a mountain. Jerusalem itself is somewhat on high ground, although as you can see, there is a valley in the middle of it, so not consistently on high ground. If I zoom out for a minute, one of the places of importance that is nearby, but not specifically Jerusalem, is the town of Bethany. This is mentioned a few times. This is where Martha and Mary and Lazarus live. This is the traditional location of Lazarus's grave, marked with the star here. And that is probably roughly where Jesus was when he stayed with them. And as he traveled over the Mount of Olives to go to Jerusalem, we know he did that a couple of times. The traditional route for Palm Sunday is this brown path here. We do know he would have had to come from Bethany to Jerusalem. More likely, he would have maybe entered through this gate, but that's blocked up today. So when people celebrate today, they use this brown path starting at Bethphage on the Mount of Olives and going down this way. But of course, he would have started in Bethany and then proceeded this way in some route. A couple more details before we get into the passion details, which is where most of our information lies. The first thing is there are two pools that are mentioned in John. This lower one here is the pool of Siloam. It is connected by a rock-cut tunnel, also called Hezekiah's Tunnel, this purple line, to the Gihon Spring. Jesus tells a blind man to go wash his eyes there, and he receives his sight. We've already previously talked about the pool of Bethesda up here in this purplish area. Also, a miraculous healing takes place there. So we have our pools, we have our modern day walls marked. But the next thing we want to consider is the ancient walls, because they were not entirely the same. So this was honestly one of the more difficult parts of my research because it's really hard to gather all the data that we have on the walls at that time. There's just a lot of data and not all of it agrees. So the ancient wall is a little bit difficult to determine, but my best guess based on the different sources I could find and compare went something like this. Let me take away that modern wall for a second. And then if I put it back, we can see pretty clearly that there are a lot of places where they overlap and even run along the same lines, but there are definite differences. If I take away that modern wall again, so we can focus on the ancient wall, this is about what would have been there during the first century, the time of Christ. But there could have been adjustments throughout his lifetime and after his lifetime. And we have quite a few kind of inner walls as the city expanded that would have been around. So here are some, and here's another possibility of walls that may have existed. And depending on who you ask, when these walls were built will vary slightly. So the exact area enclosed during the time of Christ, people might argue about slightly, but it is something close to this. Okay, now I'm going to take away those inner walls because they're not adding a lot for us right at this particular point. So we have kind of our main stage set. This is where Jesus comes for his passion. We've already talked about Palm Sunday with the progression down the Mount of Olives, maybe following this brown path, maybe somewhere south of that or slightly different, but over the Mount of Olives and down into the Kidron Valley and then up into Jerusalem. From there are different things that happens, but we're not given a lot of geography after that point until we get to the point of the Last Supper. So let's start with the location of the upper room. Two places I found suggested for this, and let me zoom in so that we can see a little better. Both of them are kind of on the Western Hill. There is one here near the Dormition Abbey called the Cenacle, and there's a second place that is located in the Armenian Quarter that has been suggested as a possibility. My understanding is both of these have some evidence that argues in their favor, but I'm not sure that we're sure of either of them. The Cenacle is probably the more traditional one where more pilgrims go. So that's the one we are just going to go with for today. Jesus and his disciples would have had a meal up here in the Cenacle in the upper room. We know after that they proceeded across the Kidron Valley to the Mount of Olives to a place called Gethsemane. So we don't know the exact path Jesus would have taken from the upper room, but I chose to kind of go along where the roads are because honestly, the way the modern road goes is maybe one of the more walkable ways to get to this point. Now, the traditional site of Gethsemane is here on the lower slope of the Mount of Olives. There's a church here called the Church of All Nations. There's some very old olive trees here that probably were not old enough to be there during the time of Christ, but are quite old. And this is the traditional site of the Garden of Gethsemane. It could have been much larger. It could have been all over this region, but it probably was somewhere roughly in that area. We know that is where Judas came with guards. It seems likely that Judas got those guards from the temple area, which is marked here, and possibly also from the Antonia Fortress, which I'll mark here, just north of the temple area. This, again, is somewhat debated how large it was, exactly where it was, but it seems to have been kind of in the northwestern corner of the temple area. So roughly here. Judas brought guards from the temple and from there came to get Jesus. And from there, they went to Caiaphas and Annas. Those were the high priests. Technically, Caiaphas was the high priest, and Annas was his father-in-law who had been high priest in previous times. There's debate. There's uncertainty, really, over where their houses were. And there's a few possibilities. They're most likely to be somewhere on the Western Hill, somewhere over here. One possible place is the Church of St. Peter in Gallicantu. There's a statue here depicting Peter denying Jesus and rooster crowing. So this is one of the traditional sites of that, which would make it the house of Caiaphas or Annas. There's also a traditional location that Warren marked on his map and that other pilgrims have marked on their map up here, fairly close to the Cenacle. So it's possible that Caiaphas and or Annas could have lived there. Somebody has also suggested that the burnt house in the Jewish quarter was probably the home of some priests that were high ranking. It could have been Caiaphas and Annas, or they could have been nearby somewhere in this area. All of those are reasonable places to suppose they could have been, but we are not sure that any of them is the correct place. We're also not sure if Caiaphas and Annas lived in the same place or maybe in adjoining places. It seems like Jesus had to be somewhat transferred from one to the other, but we don't know if that was a walk across a courtyard or a walk across the city. But these are our three best guesses for Caiaphas and Annas. At one point in time, Jesus is also tried before the Sanhedrin. And again, we're not entirely sure where that would have been, but most likely it would have been somewhere in the temple area. So again, in this purple section, Jesus was probably taken after he left Caiaphas and Annas. After Jesus left there, he was taken to Pilate. And again, we have several possibilities for where Pilate could have been. One of those we already marked. That is the Antonia fortress. Pilate could have been staying there, but most people argue that it's more likely he would have been staying somewhere that wasn't a Roman barracks, that was more comfortable and more befitting his position. One of those places suggested is Herod's palace, which was probably somewhere over here again on the western hill and seemed to maybe have a private entrance, private gate outside. Some people suggest that the Jewish leaders, when they brought Jesus, stayed outside the gate so as not to defile themselves. They probably could have done the same thing on the other side, though, so that's a little uncertain. Another place that Pilate could have been, the Praetorium could have been, is somewhere around the location of the Nia church, which has been destroyed, and the church before it was destroyed. So again, this is very uncertain, but perhaps somewhere in this area was the Praetorium that Pilate judged Jesus from. We also know that Herod was staying in Jerusalem at the same time. So if Herod wasn't staying in Herod's palace, where was he staying? Possibly in the Hasmonean palace, which maybe was here-ish. Again, not entirely sure. Also a place of significance in this area was Herod's Three Towers. So there are 5 places basically that Herod and or Pilate could have been staying during this time, and we're not necessarily certain of any of them. Archaeological evidence is really hard to come by in a city that has been built up over thousands and thousands of years, and the layers before it are buried or destroyed. So we are just not sure of any of these places, but all of these are reasonable guesses. I think that the favored one, which I will leave up, is Herod's palace. Most academics seem to think this is the most likely place for Pilate to have been, and that the Hasmonean palace is the most likely place for Herod to have been. Herod isn't mentioned in John's account, so we are going to ignore that one for right now. We've just said that the most likely place for Pilate to have been was this yellow place over here where Herod's palace was, but that is not what tradition ended up being. Tradition ended up saying that the most likely place that Pilate was is the Antonia fortress. And if you have heard of the Via Dolorosa, it runs from the same gate that is traditionally entered for Palm Sunday through the Old City, across where the Antonia Fortress would have been, to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Most Protestants that I am familiar with are not terribly interested in the Via Dolorosa, and that's just as it is. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. A lot of these spots mark things that are in biblical accounts, but a few of them mark things that are more traditional, but still interesting and worth considering as we talk about Jesus's last days. So I can talk about the Via Dolorosa more, but it's roughly that yellow path, and those yellow stars would have been the stations of the cross. There are 14 stations of the cross. 9 of them are outside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the last 5 are inside. To refresh ourselves, Jesus would have been taken from Gethsemane to the home of Caiaphas and Annas, probably then to the temple area, then to Pilate, probably then to Herod, maybe somewhere over here, back to Pilate, and then eventually taken to be crucified. Our conflicting, more likely to be archaeologically accurate Via Dolorosa is more this green zigzag. The Via Dolorosa really commemorates the trip from Pilate to the cross. So maybe just this single dashed line would have been the more correct Via Dolorosa. We are almost finished. We have considered most places of significance, but the last place that we do need to consider is the place of the cross, where the death and resurrection of Jesus happened. And there are two places that claim this. One of them we have already pointed out, and let me emphasize that one here. That is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is the traditional site of the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. And there's significant evidence that supports its claim. I'm not going to go into all that right now, but most scholars seem to think this is the most likely location of Jesus's death, burial, and resurrection. There is another place that makes claim to it, and that is the Garden Tomb up in this area north of the city. You will notice that both of these areas are outside the ancient city walls, but the current city walls contain the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is why some people have argued to discard it. But the ancient walls would not have contained it. It would have been in a place called the Muristan, this kind of light green area. It would have been outside the walls during Jesus's time. So that's really not a question for either of them. The Garden Tomb and Gordon's Calvary up here is a lovely spot. The garden is lovely. It has a nice feel to it. The tomb is not the right kind of tomb at all. But if you want to experience a garden tomb, it is more like it probably would have been in Jesus's day than this church. That said, there's very little evidence of any sort to support its claims. So we are going to take it off of our list for now. All right, so I think that covers most of the areas of significance mentioned in John in the area of Jerusalem, specifically in the last week or so of Jesus's life. A few of them, again, like the Pool of Bethesda we talked about earlier on, but most of these are specifically mentioned even the last day of Jesus's life. So hopefully that gives you some quick overview of kind of the places we're looking at, a few of the brief arguments for why some places are better than others or why we just don't know. And honestly, that's true of a lot of places. We know it was somewhere in this area, but was it exactly at that point or that point? It's a little hard to be sure. To be honest, I spent a lot of time looking at the Via Dolorosa. Those are modern places that are marked that people visit yearly, and it was still incredibly hard to pinpoint, like, where is the Church of Simon the Cyrene? That there's a chapel there, but can you find it on a map? Good luck. So even modern places are a little bit hard to find, and some of that has to do with the different languages used and spoken, and some of that has to do with just the fact that Jerusalem is a really complicated city, and there are layers and layers and layers, and we can find some things. There's evidence that's been found of some of these walls, but exactly where they went, again, this, as I showed you, was some of my best guesses. So definitely fun to look at. And we'll revisit it again when we get more into John. But this is just a quick overview because this is really what I've been thinking about lately is the sites in Jerusalem. So hopefully this has been at least somewhat interesting. And if not, wait for the next video. Hopefully it'll be better. Thanks for watching. And I'll see you all next time. Bye.